Don't you love it when you pour weeks or months of your time, energy, or love into something only to make a stupid mistake and have it all fail? Yeah, neither do I. That's why in this video, I'm going to share with you the 7 most common mistakes I see new and experienced gardeners make when they're taking care of their seedlings. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Boss. I am a Colorado certified gardener and a lover of all things spicy. I'm a member of a lot of different online gardening communities, from pepper lovers to garden revival to pepper chums. Lots of places where this time of year there's new gardeners showing up or people who have been doing this for years that suddenly have a problem. And so in this video, I'm going to equip you with the knowledge to avoid some of those mistakes. But look, the 7th one on this list is something that I did this year that I'm kind of kicking myself for. So we all make mistakes. Let's jump right in. The first mistake that I see so many gardeners making, especially newer gardeners, is overwatering their seedlings. Overwatering sounds like something you're just giving it more of what it wants, right? Plants love water. You give them more water, they get more happy. Unfortunately, that's not the case. What happens when you overwater is a couple different things. The most common thing that you'll see with seedlings, though, is damping off. This is actually a fungal disease that causes your stems of your baby seedlings to basically rot right at the surface level. So if you see seedlings just fell over one day, all of a sudden they're laying down sideways, look at that stem and you'll probably see where it's kind of worn away and thinned out. You can almost sometimes see a little discoloration there as well. That's damping off. There's no coming back from that. Once that plant has fallen over, typically it's too late. The best thing you can do at that point is try to dry your area out as much as possible. Bring in an extra fan, make sure that you have good ventilation. Do not water again, and hope that you'll slow the spread of that fungal condition to your other seedlings. It is possible that seedlings that haven't necessarily fallen all the way over yet were still impacted, and so even after you correct the moisture level, you might still see a few that go down. It's an easy thing to avoid, though. Do not overwater. Overwatering means you are putting in enough water that your media is soaking wet. It should be moist, but never sopping, right? If you grab a handful of your seed starting mix and squeeze it, which it's growing seedlings, you probably don't want to do that when they're in there. But if you did and a bunch of water dripped out, that would mean it's too wet. It also shouldn't be dry. You don't want it to get totally dried out because that'll also stress the plants. So there is a balance, but it's really just about keeping it moist. So check your seedlings every couple of days for their moisture level. I prefer to just do the lift test. A well-watered container is heavier than a dry one. And so that's the first mistake you want to avoid. And so don't water on a schedule. Don't think, oh, I have to water every other day. Water when the plants need it. Give your tray a lift, poke a finger in there and see just how far down is it actually dry. If you're bottom watering, it's okay if that top layer looks a little bit dry. Look at the soil itself if you can. That's why I like these kinds of trays. I can pick it up and I can see, hey, that's perfectly moist and evenly so all the way through. So overwatering is very, very common. It's also very easy to avoid. Just use a little bit of common sense and check before you water. If it doesn't need water, don't do it. Related to overwatering, though, is something that I see a lot of gardeners doing, and that is not providing airflow. If you don't give your seedlings a good breeze, ideally from a fan that oscillates or multiple fans to cover the whole grow area, they're not going to be as well off as if you did. And there's a couple reasons for that, right? One, the movement of that air across those leaves actually helps with the transpiration. So that uptake of nutrients and water through your soil media, that goes up into the plant and eventually transpires through the leaves. And if you don't have good air movement, it's too humid in there, you can start to run into issues with things like edema. Edema is something that's mostly cosmetic in plants, but in young plants like seedlings, edema can actually be pretty damaging because you don't have a whole lot of leaf area. And so if some of that's damaged, you're getting less and less out of the natural processes that your plant needs to create energy, to transpire, and do all the things that will make it a happy seedling. The other part of this is having a fan on your seedlings actually makes them stronger. See, in nature, we have wind, right? Especially during the daytime, but sometimes at night. And so what I like to do is always make sure that my fan is running anytime the lights are running. I use a 2-fan system in my grow tent. If you don't have a grow tent, just put a box fan next to it, put a stand fan, anything that really will keep air moving across those seedlings. It'll actually encourage their stems to fight that wind. And it builds muscles, if you will, in that stem and makes it stronger. It's pretty cool stuff, and I will tell you that about 6-7 years ago, I didn't use a fan on my seedlings, and they were all weak, they were spindly, they did not transplant well, But ever since then, I've kept 1 or 2 oscillating fans right on my plants, and I use an exhaust fan since I grow in a tent. I want to make sure I'm sucking out that hot, humid air. They go out into the garden much better. They are stronger, they resist the winds that come in early spring once they are out in my garden, and I found that adding a fan, only a fan, has been one of the biggest improvements to my seedling health, period. The third most common mistake that I see gardeners of all ages, almost more so in some of the more seasoned gardeners, is not giving your seedlings enough light. A lot of people think, hey, I'm going to take these seedlings and just put them in a nice sunny window and they're going to do fine. And what do they get? They get really tall boy, leggy seedlings that are starting to lean over because they're hunting for that light. While the sun is super bright, unless you have a perfect angle in that window, typically if you're in the northern hemisphere, that needs to be a south-facing window, and that glass has no treatment for UV protection or anything like that, you're going to have a hard time. Typically, you won't get enough good quality sunlight through the narrow window at the right angle, at the right intensity, to really give those seedlings the photon energy that they crave. That's why I always recommend using grow lights. You can use darn near anything as a grow light. If you want to get serious about it, I do recommend investing in like a nice LED purpose-built grow light. They focus on the right intensity at the right spectrum to make plants happy. They are fairly energy efficient, especially compared to some of the grow lights of even 10 years ago. The new LEDs are very good. If you don't want to spend that kind of money, you can use tube lights, shop lights, right? Those are pretty much all LED these days anyhow. But those you'll want to make sure you get really close to your seedlings. If your seedlings are getting tall and stretching, that's a very good sign you just don't have enough light.
Oh, look at these guys. They're so tall and strong. Yes, so very tall, so very strong. Look at them. Just look at them.
Now, some plants, and you can see in my peppers in the tent here, some of them are taller than others, even though they're right next to each other in the very same light space. But that's also because there are genetic differences too, right? So if you have 1 or 2 in a tray that are taller than the others, that's probably just a genetic difference. If your whole tray is getting tall, or 1/2 of your tray, or maybe all the edges of your seedling tray are getting tall, they're probably not getting enough light. So even if you have a grow light, if it's not powerful enough and spread enough to really give adequate light to your whole grow area, you might see around the edges of that grow light, again, those leggy seedlings, give them more light. If your only option is in fact a windowsill, I think you just need to be very prepared for the fact that you're probably going to have some seedlings that get too tall. You might have some that fail, or you might have to really think about how you transplant them. For things like tomatoes, that's pretty easy. You can bury that stem pretty deep. But other plants are not so good with that and might actually rot if you try that. So invest in a grow light, use it properly, and your seedlings will thank you. The fourth mistake that I've seen a lot of people making in some of my garden communities is they don't thin their seedlings out either soon enough or at all. Thinning seedlings means I plant usually 2 to 3 or sometimes more seeds in each cell to ensure that I get germination from each variety. But then sometimes, oftentimes, all 3 of those seedlings grow, right? Or more. If I'm planting certain peppers that I'm looking for a specific characteristic out of a hybrid, or I really want to look for the right color on the leaves, I might plant 10, 15 seeds in one cell. Leaving multiple plants in one cell for too long is a recipe for sad seedlings. And the reason is pretty simple. Those plants are now competing with each other. You've got this tiny little bit of media in there that's not providing a ton of nutrition typically if it's seed starting mix. And so anything that that plant needs, it's now competing with the plant next to it and the plant next to it and the plant next to it. It's going to get ugly. And so if you don't thin them out, they're not going to grow that well. Their roots won't be able to expand because they'll be running into the root systems of those plants that are crammed in there with them. They will actually have a harder time getting the right amount of water and nutrient uptake once you start feeding them. So thin your seedlings. I think it's a lot of fun. You can see here, I've got just the pile of pepper seedling babies that I murdered yesterday. I went through and culled hundreds of little seedlings, hundreds, out of my trays because I've got 180 pepper varieties growing this year, and I only really want 1 of each for the most part. A few I left a couple extras in the tray because I'm looking for specific characteristics from a cross, or I know they're an ornamental that I can easily split while they're young and grow multiples of because I happen to think they're really pretty. And I get this beautiful, beautiful, I don't know, pepper leaf salad. This is all going to go in my compost, right? So that'll actually help grow plants in the future because it will turn into healthy compost in my bin. So thin your seedlings. I know it's tough. Some people really fall in love with these little babies and they think, well, I can't kill them. All of these plants grew. They deserve to survive. Be tough, be ruthless, take pleasure in it. The other part that I love is that when you're done, your seedling trays look so neat and organized because you've just got rows of plants, one in each. It's therapy. Don't be afraid to cull your plants. Don't be afraid to thin your seedlings. It's part of the gardening process. Yes, these could have all grown up into healthy peppers, but then I would have had like 500 peppers growing around and I would have lost out on great green material for my compost. Moving right along, the number 5 mistake that I see gardeners making often when they're taking care of their seedlings is thinking that they shouldn't feed them. There's a lot of misinformation on the internet, right? You can go on YouTube and say anything. It's kind of cool. But at the same time, it can get confusing. I had heard for years, hey, you don't need to feed seedlings. Maybe once you pot them up or once they have 2 sets of true leaves, then you can start giving them a low-dose fertilizer. That's not great advice, to be honest. Feeding your plants sooner means they will grow faster, be healthier, happier, and more resilient. While it is possible in some cases to really harm your plant by overdosing fertilizer, especially in things that are maybe synthetic high nitrogen type fertilizers, that's possible. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying just dump as much Miracle-Gro on these things as you want, but you don't have to be overly cautious either. As soon as I get past the cotyledon stage, so those seed leaves that come out, I start feeding. If I'm seeing little bits of true leaves come through, they're ready to eat. The seed itself provides just enough nutrition for that plant to sprout and get those first leaves going so that photosynthesis and other processes can begin to grow a bigger plant. If you're growing in seed starting mix like this, it's usually very, very low or free of nutrition. It doesn't have any fertilizer in it. So I like to use a liquid fertilizer. I do start with it at about 1/2 to 3/4 strength for that first feeding. But after that, after about a week when I'm ready for another feeding, they're getting a full strength nutrient. I have never cooked a plant using nutrients at their proper ratio. And that doesn't matter if it's organic nutrient, which I don't use really indoors. I use synthetics indoors because typically it's in a media that doesn't provide natural fertilization, right? It's cocoa, it's potting mix, that kind of stuff. And so I want to make sure that I'm getting good, controlled, easy to uptake nutrients right to the roots of my plants. If you don't feed them, they might be okay for a while. They're going to struggle. They won't thrive without nutrients. So don't be afraid. Follow the directions. I like to use hydroponic nutrients when they're in the seedling trays. It's easier for me to just dump some of that in my watering can, pour the water in the bottom of the tray. They're watered, they're fed. Piece of cake. The number 6 most common mistake that I've seen some gardeners make over the last few years is they're not potting up their seedlings soon enough. So if you start your seedlings in a tray like this, in these, 3/4 to 1 inch cells, or even smaller, it's important that you don't leave the seedlings in there for too long. What will happen is that their root system is really trying to grow at this stage in life. They want to have really robust and complete root systems that will help them uptake all of the things that they need and grow into big plants, right? And that becomes a problem in these little cells. What you don't want is your plant to get root bound. If those roots really start circling and creating a mess where they're all run down the edges and they're starting to circle back in on themselves, you're setting your plant up for a hard time when you do transplant it. Now, things like peppers and even tomatoes, you can be pretty rough on those roots, but that's not the case with all plants. Since I happen to grow a lot of peppers, I've been able to save some mistakes where I waited too long by really pulling at those roots, trying to get them back growing outwards rather than inwards. Plants need those roots to grow out and spread so they can take up a wide area of nutrient and provide a good base and structural support for the plant when it's out in the garden. And so if they get in a habit of growing like this, it's going to be a really bad time for that plant. And so the key is to transplant when that root system is visible and healthy and long, but not swirling, not overly root bound. If it looks like you have some sort of a woven nest around your seed cell, you've probably got a problem. Keeping the plant happy through these early stages of life is the single biggest contributor to vigorous growth later on. If they get stunted because of circling or bound roots at this stage, they have a really hard time focusing on growth because you're going to have to do something to mess with those roots probably. Or if you don't do that, they're not going to have the proper root system to actually be vigorous, healthy growing plants. So make sure you're keeping an eye on it. Again, I can't say enough about these silly trays. They're really cheap on Amazon. I'll leave a link to them. I can look in here and see those roots at any time, right? That is a huge saver for me. I haven't had a terribly root-bound seedling in years since I started doing this. Keep on top of it. Your plants will thank you. And finally, the seventh mistake that a lot of people, including this guy right here, made this year.
He's an idiot!
Is not thinking about algae control. Algae grows almost anywhere where you have a wet media and sunlight or grow light, right? And so I did something stupid this year and I filled a bunch of these trays before I was ready to plant seeds. My media was moist and I set them in my grow tent. I'm like, I'll get to these in a few days. It ended up being almost 2 weeks later before I actually planted seeds. So they were in my grow tent, which has an automatic light cycle, turning the light on, turning the light off. You know what happened? Before I even planted in some of these, they were covered in algae. Algae won't necessarily hurt your seeds or your seedlings, but it can be a competitor. It is a living organism that's going to use the same nutrients from that soil that your plant might use. And I've had some cases in the past where it seems like it inhibits that seed germination. I need to go look and see if there's some science behind that. I've never really looked into it, but to me, it always felt like the seeds that didn't sprout were often covered under the most algae. Now, how do you control algae in a situation like this? In the past, I've done something which is probably not the most recommended, but that's using a diluted hydrogen peroxide solution on the top of those seed cells when it starts to grow algae. And that will usually kill that algae and won't harm your plant. It's got to be diluted, I would say 3% or less hydrogen peroxide. If it's stronger than that, you're almost certainly putting a little bit of extra risk at maybe burning your plants or hurting them. Try not to get it on the green leaves of your plants. Focus that peroxide solution just down there at the soil level, and it should do a pretty good job killing off that algae. However, there's something that I've seen a lot of gardeners do over the last couple of years that I said I was going to do this year, and then I didn't because I forgot to buy vermiculite. You can actually put a layer of vermiculite across the top of your seed trays after you plant them. It won't inhibit or interfere with your seed's germination, but it will keep the light off of that soil surface, which means that algae won't grow, or it'll grow significantly less. Big shout out to Gardening in Canada. Her channel was the one that first turned me on to this, I think last season when she first mentioned it. And I thought, that's brilliant. And then I didn't do it again. So next year, I'm going to give it a try. I will be starting seeds under a layer of vermiculite because it also holds a little bit of moisture and keeps things nice there, you know. It could potentially help with fungus gnats. I'm not sure, but that's a whole other set of issues. In terms of algae, the best bet is prevention. Keep the light off of your moist soil as much as you can. Once these things start sprouting and growing, the leaves of the plant themselves will shade out that soil surface, and so that does a pretty good job controlling algae. Prevent algae if you can. If you can't prevent algae, there's different ways to deal with it. I actually start with a mechanical removal. I just scrape it off the top. That's the easiest for me. It'll come back though. And so if I need to, I'll hit it with the peroxide solution. But next year, I'm going to be a smart guy and not make this mistake again. I'm going to cover the top of my seed trays with vermiculite and see how that goes. So those are the 7 most common mistakes I see people making while they're taking care of their seedlings. It's a real shame to see people lose months and weeks of hard work and the seedlings that they love. We all form this kind of bond with our plants. Even though I take joy in thinning them out, I do still love my little baby pepper plants, right? And my tomatoes and my flowers. I've got a lot of stuff going this year. I'm going to do my best to take care of all of them to the best of my ability, and that means avoiding these mistakes. If you want to learn a little bit more about how I start my seeds, watch this video here. If you want to see me eat something spicy and suffer, watch this video here. Remember, plants help us grow.